The morning of June 18th, 1815, dawned grey and wet across the Belgian countryside near the village of Waterloo. The rain had been relentless throughout the night, turning the fields into a quagmire of thick mud. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, stood with his army of 72,000 men, facing the combined forces of the Duke of Wellington and his Anglo-Allied army. This would be the battle that would decide the fate of Europe. Napoleon had escaped from exile on the island of Elba just 3 months earlier, returning to France in a dramatic comeback that shocked the European powers. He quickly rebuilt his army and marched north into Belgium, hoping to defeat the Allied armies before they could unite against him. His strategy was bold and simple: strike fast, divide his enemies, and destroy them separately before they could combine their strength. Wellington had positioned his army along a ridge south of Waterloo, a defensive position he had carefully chosen. His 68,000 troops were a mixed force of British, Dutch, Belgian and German soldiers. To the east, the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher was marching to join him, but they were still hours away. Napoleon knew he had to attack before the Prussians arrived. The French Emperor delayed his attack until late morning, waiting for the ground to dry enough for his artillery to be effective and his cavalry to maneuver. This delay would prove costly. At 11:30 in the morning, the French artillery opened fire with a thunderous barrage, and the battle began. Napoleon's brother Jerome led the first major assault against Hougoumont, a fortified farmhouse on Wellington's right flank. The French threw wave after wave of troops at the position, but the British guards defending it held firm. The fighting around Hougoumont would continue all day, tying down thousands of French troops in a brutal struggle that achieved nothing for Napoleon's cause. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the main French assault began. d'Erlon's corps, consisting of 16,000 infantry, advanced in massive columns toward Wellington's left centre. The French drums beat the pas de charge as the soldiers marched forward through the mud. Wellington's infantry, hidden behind the ridge, waited until the French were close before rising and unleashing devastating volleys of musket fire. The British cavalry then charged, smashing into the French columns and driving them back in confusion. But the British cavalry, caught up in the excitement of their success, charged too far. They crashed into the French artillery positions, but were then counterattacked by French lancers and cuirassiers. The British cavalry suffered terrible losses, losing nearly half their heavy cavalry in this single engagement. It was a tactical victory that came at an enormous cost. Throughout the afternoon, Napoleon continued to pound Wellington's line with artillery and infantry attacks. The Allied line bent but never broke. Wellington moved constantly along his position, reinforcing weak points and encouraging his men. "Stand firm," he told them. Around 4 o'clock, Marshal Ney, Napoleon's most aggressive commander, observed what he thought was a retreat in Wellington's centre. In reality, Wellington was simply moving wounded men to the rear. Ney decided to launch a massive cavalry charge to exploit this perceived weakness. Thousands of French cavalry, the finest in Europe, thundered up the slope toward Wellington's lines. But Wellington's infantry formed squares, bristling formations of men with bayonets pointing outward in all directions. The French cavalry crashed against these squares again and again, but they could not break them. Without infantry support, the cavalry charges were futile. Horses and men fell in heaps, but the British squares held. Ney launched charge after charge, losing thousands of cavalrymen in a series of attacks that achieved nothing. As the afternoon wore on, the sound of distant cannon fire could be heard from the east. The Prussians were arriving. Blücher's army had marched through terrible conditions to reach the battlefield, and now they were attacking Napoleon's right flank. Napoleon was forced to divert more and more troops to hold off the Prussian assault, weakening his attacks against Wellington. At 6:30 in the evening, Napoleon made his final gamble. He sent forward his Imperial Guard, the elite veterans who had never been defeated in battle. These were his best troops, and he committed them to one last desperate assault on Wellington's centre. The Guard advanced in perfect formation, drums beating, through the smoke and carnage of the battlefield. Wellington's troops, exhausted and battered, watched the Imperial Guard approach. When the Guard reached close range, Wellington gave the order, "Now, Maitland, now's your time!" The British Guards Brigade rose from where they had been lying down and fired a devastating volley at point-blank range. The Imperial Guard staggered under the impact. British infantry then attacked from the flank, and for the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard began to fall back. The cry went up across the French army, "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats. Panic spread through the French ranks. The army that had fought so bravely all day began to dissolve. Wellington, sensing the moment, stood in his stirrups and waved his hat toward the French lines, the signal for a general advance. The entire Allied line surged forward. The French army collapsed into a chaotic retreat. Only the Imperial Guard maintained some order, forming squares to cover the withdrawal. Napoleon himself was nearly captured in the confusion. The Prussian cavalry pursued the fleeing French through the night, turning the retreat into a rout. The Battle of Waterloo was over. The French had suffered approximately 25,000 casualties, with another 8,000 captured. The Allies had lost about 22,000 men, and the Prussians 7,000. But beyond the numbers, Napoleon's power was broken forever. 4 days later, he abdicated for the second and final time. He would spend the rest of his life in exile on the remote island of St Helena, where he died in 1821. Waterloo ended 23 years of almost continuous warfare in Europe. It established a balance of power that would last for decades and marked the end of French dominance on the continent. The battle has become a symbol of decisive defeat, giving the English language the phrase, "meeting one's Waterloo." For Wellington, it was the culmination of his military career. For Napoleon, it was the end of an empire and a legend. The muddy fields of Waterloo had witnessed one of history's most important battles, a clash that shaped the course of the 19th century and beyond.